As of next week, unvaccinated Hamilton police officers who were put on leave will be allowed to return to work again when Ontario lifts its proof of vaccination requirements. And for many, it raises the question as to whether the same decision will be made in other sectors too. And joining us now with more, employment lawyer Lior Samfiru. Good morning, Lior. Thanks again for joining us.
Good morning, Candace.
So let's take a closer look at Hamilton Police and tell us, are these types of recalls of human resources becoming more common? And what are the rights of employees and employers in these cases?
So, Candace, since the government of Ontario and other governments have started rolling back vaccine passport mandates, employers have started realizing, well, wait a second, maybe our own policies now have to be reconsidered. Maybe it wasn't even necessary for us to impose mandatory vaccination policies. And what I've been seeing over the past number of weeks is a lot of employers recalling employees, those that they've either let go or that they've put on a leave because of their vaccine status. Now, while that is fine and good, what I've been told by many employees, many of which I represent, is the fact that they've now lost some confidence and trust in their employer. They don't feel that they should have been put off work to begin with. So a lot of employers, surprisingly to them, are getting resistance from these employees. They actually don't want to come back to work. So those employers may find themselves with a short staff and potentially liability for severance for their employees. So I think this whole situation has been a very bad experience for employers with really no help provided to them by the government.
And Lior, we are fast approaching the 2-year anniversary of the start of the pandemic, and there are still people who haven't been called back since that first round of layoffs back in spring of 2020. So for anyone who falls into that category, what rights do they have and what action, if any, can they take?
You're right, Candace. There's people that have been off on the layoff, off work for going on 2 years now. That's a long period of time. Now, for those employees, they can continue waiting and see what happens. But here's the other options that they have. They can choose to treat this layoff as a termination now. They don't have to wait. They don't have to wait and see what happens and worry about that. So they can say, now that's a termination. You, employer, owe me severance. Keeping in mind, though, that there's a 2-year limitation period. So for many people, those that were laid off in the beginning of the pandemic, that limitation period is going to expire in March of this year, in the next few weeks. So if you're going to act, you have to act now.
I see. And also on Thursday, the province announced plans to require employers to tell staff if they're being electronically monitored. So what are your thoughts on this legislation, still proposed legislation, and what should employers and employees know?
So the legislation says that employers with 25 or more employees, or it's going to say that, are going to have to inform employees if they're monitoring them and how they're monitored. So that's obviously good news for those individuals that may use company computers or drive company vehicles. Up until now, there was no way to actually know if you're being monitored. So for many employees, that's going to be a peace of mind. And as long as employers comply with that, employees will know what's happening with them. So I certainly think that's a good first step towards ensuring some employee privacy.
And finally, Lior, what if an employee refuses to be surveilled and doesn't want to be subject to any type of monitoring? What rights does that employee have?
And that is, I think, the problems with this legislation. It doesn't go far enough. So while employers are going to have to tell employees if they're being monitored, what happens if the employee says, well, okay, great, but I don't want to be monitored. I don't want to have to have the GPS on me. Well, in that situation, that employee doesn't really have a choice, or the legislation doesn't protect them. There is no legislation currently that provides protections from surveillance. And if an employee refuses to be surveilled or monitored, they can be let go. I would have rather seen legislation that says, employer, if you're going to monitor and surveil employees, you have to do that in very limited circumstances. There has to be a good business reason for it. And you only have to do it as long as it's necessary. My concern is that the proposed legislation doesn't actually go that far.
I see. Well, we will see how that develops. But thank you, as always, for your insight. That is employment lawyer Lior Samfiru. Have a great day.